This program deals with devil worship and satanic beliefs. It contains explicit scenes and descriptions of violent crimes and rituals.
Americans are asking, who attacked our country?
You have declared a subliminal jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
And night fell on a different world.
And Iblis is thinking, I should be getting this position, not Adam, and this guy is created from dirt.
And how does the army feel about you being head of the Temple of Set?
And the conspiracy theorists can say what they will, but
I want you to give me power over Adam, and I want you to give me soldiers and minions and all of these things.
The people had so much to gain and had such a material motive for putting in a position I'm in. We'll never let the true facts of some of their boards to the world.
And I want you to be able to give me the ability to whisper into the hearts of mankind.
And who was the grotto leader? You don't remember the name of a person who involved you in murder?
These people are in very high positions, yeah. Yes.
Welcome back to Subliminal Jihad, episode 54. I am your co-host, Dimitri.
I'm Khalid.
And today, I guess we're going to do something a little different from what we normally do, which is like spend 3 hours investigating a famous person for like how sus they are.
Mm-hmm.
And instead,
that's what we normally do.
That's what we normally do.
Yeah.
That's what we normally do. As was heard in our most recent Sus Chomsky episode, that's kind of the stock and trade of subliminal jihad. But we are not full on doomers, and I think we do have figures that we admire and view positively. And the subject of today's episode is probably the most admired person for me that we've covered on the podcast so far. Yeah. And as we'll see, there are a lot of aspects to this person, Paul Leroy Robeson, that kind of intersect with like a few different like lines of inquiry or like, areas that we've delved into a lot, like theater, Marxist politics, COINTELPRO and MK Ultra, Hollywood, the stage, like theatricality, the interplay between theatricality and politics, and the music industry in a way as well.
Definitely.
Yeah. So
I mean, Paul Robeson lived in a time where, like, the world of music, like live performance, like recording, like, music recordings were increasingly a thing, but live performance was still, like, very central. And so, like, the worlds of, like, theater and of, like, live music performance, those things were, like, very connected, more so than perhaps we associate them today. And, like, theater was, more mainstream. Theater has been like increasingly, like live theater has been increasingly like sort of marginalized and subculturalized, but he was like a super, his theatrical performances made him like a superstar, in a way that like now, like, if someone's a superstar in theater, they got to cross over to like Hollywood to really be, not that Paul Robeson didn't do that also. He was in like the Showboat movie and everything.
He did, but as we'll get to, had a very kind of archetypally negative experience with Hollywood, and I think is like really instructive. I mean, even before we get to the subject of kind of like Paul Robeson's political life and political philosophies, I think it just kind of setting him up in a frame here. I think there's so many interesting things about his life, but I think to start out with, for anybody that's like not too familiar with him, he is one of the most probably accomplished just Americans, like just not even talking about African Americans, though he's arguably one of the most distinguished and accomplished individuals in African American history, but really just American history as well. And even as a like public figure and a celebrity, it's hard to fathom today somebody that would have the level of stature that Paul Robeson
really
achieved.
He's like a combination of like Colin Kaepernick,
I wouldn't even. I'm gonna force you to retract that right now, because not to bag on Kaepernick.
It's like if you took Colin Kaepernick and like combined him with like someone, you have to combine him with someone else to get to the level
I would almost say it's more like taking like LeBron James and like Denzel Washington and Malcolm X.
Yeah,
like minus the Islam.
Like Malcolm X on his own is kind of like as big of like a political figure, I feel like, as Paul Robeson. Although he is, one thing I will say is that Malcolm X is more well known now.
Exactly,
which is interesting.
Exactly. That's a huge thing about. That's what. That's kind of like. Yeah, that's really the thing with it, is that he was so preeminent in like multiple different fields, and then had this entire kind of life of political activism, and basically is unknown. I mean, we're recording this at the end of Black History Month, and I think besides maybe some like socialist type accounts that you would follow on Twitter or something, in terms of the mainstream of like celebrating Black figures in history, Paul Robeson is almost uniformly always left out of the conversation, right?
Yeah.
Like he has just been quietly sort of like downplayed and virtually effectively erased, to the point where a lot of people hardly even remember him, or if they do, it's because like, oh yeah, didn't he sing Old Man River or something? Yeah. Or even if they basically are aware of his activism,
knows Old
there's
Man
like layers
River,
of
like
it.
I
don't know it. Yeah, that's the thing. Now
I think it might be because he, for one, like the arena that he was in, you can compare him maybe to Muhammad Ali, but the arena that he was in of like singing, it was not as like hyper masculine or like as as much like a direct allegory maybe for politics, or as an easily accessible one as Muhammad Ali's sport of boxing. And he didn't, obviously he wasn't assassinated in a spectacular way. He wasn't like and also maybe part of it is that like those figures came later, like in the heat of the 60s, like when television was more taking off, and the media culture was able to sort of latch on to them a bit more, like, and to engage them a bit more. But yeah, it definitely, I think also maybe it's because of his, as you mentioned, like his more direct connection with communism. Because even though those figures obviously resisted like imperialism in various ways and spoke out against it like very forcefully and made sacrifices to fight against it, Paul Robeson maybe was more directly aligned, at least in the popular imagination, and to an extent like in his actual politics, with like communism, like big C communism,
big C, big C. That is a thing that, and even when people kind of will mention Paul Robeson, that is something that is either a little bit downplayed now, like they might be more apt to describe him as like a socialist or just like a progressive, or they would say it as kind of like, yes, he was so great and brilliant, but he wasn't perfect. He said nice things about Stalin, that kind of thing. And but like really there hasn't been much of a reckoning at all with basically with his legacy. And I mean, I would also say, just as an aside, like we'll kind of get into like his political stances, but he's also probably like the American socialist or communist that I kind of admire the most, in terms of the positions that he took and the way he articulated kind of what he was advocating, and his because even though he was pretty much a big C communist, he never was an official member of any communist party and was very supportive of the Soviet Union, but at the same time spoke in a very kind of American language about I think he was incredibly skilled at sort of translating the appeal of something like Marxism or Marxist politics into an American context, into an African American context, into like an American labor context, and I think that was one of the things that like made him particularly dangerous. and like made people like J. Edgar Hoover feel that they really had to like neutralize him somehow. And as we'll see down the line, I think they pulled it off, though, you know, they didn't kill him, but they took him out of the game right as like the 60s were beginning and the civil rights movement was going to. So it's like, whereas, you know, I think that the US government had basically, you know, heavy involvement in both the killing of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, but kind of let them grow in influence for a number of years before deciding that they were going too far and they were dangerous. It's like Paul Robeson wasn't even allowed to like show up to the civil rights movement because he was like, he would have taken it, he would have offered a perspective, and he was so persuasive and beloved by lots of people. I mean, we'll talk about the incident that kind of like catalyzed like his disappearance from the public scene, but it's very sus and sinister and fascinating.
Yeah, and I mean, he did like do a lot of like on the ground like activism, you know, but maybe before like the beginning of like the civil rights movement proper, like being sort of initiated, like associated with Martin Luther King, like, but he did a lot of like on the ground agitation for the rights of like PSC and in the U.S. and like it was. Yeah, I mean,
in the 50s, like, he was involved in the 50s, basically. So he was, so I wouldn't say he was totally boxed out of it, but like kind of the crest of it in like the early, mid to late 60s, especially when things got increasingly radical. It's like he was already that radical in the late 50s and early 60s.
Yeah, and I think that for that reason, like, I think that maybe there was, because of like the work that people did, like the work that people like Paul Robeson did, society as a whole was like more amenable to like the goals of the civil rights movement, like white society was, you know, like there were inroads being made, like people like Kennedy and Johnson like were open to like considering like these changes, but like in the climate that Paul like. Hopefully we'll read a little bit about like some of the, you know, things like Paul Robeson's concert, like in Peekskill and things like that. That like, you know, you can really see like the work that he was doing in like a very hostile environment. And like in the same way that people like Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali were received by many with just like absolute like disdain and like, you know, like hostility and like it just treated like, how dare you like have this like presumptuousness to like you know, challenge like this power structure. Like it was even like what Paul Robeson encountered was, you know, there were still people who supported those figures, like they still had like you know, allies, as Paul Robeson did as well, but like the hostility that he faced was really something.
He did. That was very. There were white mobs there. They uncovered the union. Some of the local unions came to provide security, which is just, I mean, such a breath of fresh air from like, let's get the Hells Angels to like, you know, like, you know, do security for our Bad Acid concert and like kill a bunch of black people instead. You know, Paul Robeson was like really big about the marriage between the labor movement and like the workers movement and the civil rights movement, and they were like, he saw, you know, really, he was really kind of ahead of the curve, and I think correct about that. So they had, you know, this line of like union, you know, a lot of like white union workers like protecting him, and then they uncovered 2 snipers' nests at the Peekskill concert. You know, there's some crackers out there that basically wanted to take a shot at him during the concert, but they foiled it. So that was just the level of like violence, and the police just stood back and pretty much did nothing.
Oh, absolutely, Talk about like the police let it happen. Like it was absolutely, and this was like, you know, like the lynching heyday. Like they were just outraged. Like, we'll definitely go into that in detail at some point in this episode, because
but he was you know, to cop a very cliche phrase, like he was doing the work, but he really was like doing the work. Like he would go to these, you know, sites of like labor strikes and stuff, and then sing for everybody and like give speeches, and people absolutely loved it. I mean, it was fantastic. And you know, for people like J. Edgar Hoover, it had to be stopped. And and I was going to also mention that not only did he get like a virulent, like right-wing, racist, whatever, like virulently anti-communist kind of pushback, but he also got a treatment that we've discussed a number of times before, where he definitely got ermed a lot by the more white liberal press for a lot of these things. They earned him. They earned it when he would say, I believe, with the first time, his famous quote, when I visited the Soviet Union, I felt for the first time like a full human being, and there was no trace of color prejudice in the way I was treated. That type of stuff was getting like good white liberal New York journalists to basically go, moving on, and kind of like basically that kind of line of it, which probably was also like CIA influenced, was to say that like Paul Robeson got duped by the communists and the Soviets. They tricked him. They tricked his beautiful, simple, romantic mind into basically supporting this horrible thing. And you really can't hold it against him too much because he does care. But, sorry, Paul. Like, no, Paul, the Soviet Union is not, free of color. But, like that kind of thing. Yeah. Like, just that kind of like picking at him. And he was aware of that. He was very aware of that and would call it out at times. Like, people condescending to him.
I think that he also was aware of like the fact that he was like an American celebrity, and he was aware of like the role that he played in this like geopolitical a battle of optics. Like he wasn't like being duped. Like of course the Soviets rolled out the red carpet so to speak for him, but like it wasn't like he was like I'm unaware of this, like the way that people treat me. Like he was making a statement like in saying those things like about something that he could affect, which was a situation of like the racism, of racism in the United States, and like the like commiserated condition of black people.
Exactly. And he always kept his eye on the ball, but he also, as we'll see later in some of his statements about the Soviet Union, when he was under extreme pressure to basically, they were trying to twist his arm in every which way to just sign like an anti-communist statement that like communism's bad, and they took away his passport for about 5 years until the Supreme Court, I think, invalidated that. But they basically were saying you can't get your passport back or leave the country until you sign like an anti-communist affidavit, like declaring that like communism sucks. And he was like, no, I'm not going to. But what you see with him when he's making those statements is that he was very tactical and strategic about what he said and what he didn't say about the Soviet Union. And it was anything but. And at times, like, he would critique them in one particular instance, like we'll get to later, but like did it through art in like a veiled way that basically wasn't like, American celebrity runs back to America and starts like holds a press conference and like they're doing bad things over there, like he didn't just like kind of freak out and like become an anti-communist like after learning some kind of like personally disturbing information, but he still believed in like the overall kind of struggle and like the purpose of the Soviet Union as a bulwark against the right wing of like the American empire. And so I think that's all to say that like people didn't have to coach or fill Paul Robeson's head with any of that stuff. I think at one of the Senate hearings they ask him, like, when you were in Russia, did you attend any classes? And he's like, no. Basically the implication being that like, did they take you to like a communism class and like read you Marx? And he's like, I hope you're aware that Marx is not written in Russian originally, and like it was written there's English translations. I read that perfectly well in my own time, thank you. And just like that idea of like, did they get into your head, Mr. Robeson? Did they Manchurian candidate you? And this is a guy like he spoke, nobody knows exactly how many languages he spoke, but the common number that gets thrown around is 12.
Wow.
He's a graduate of Columbia Law School. I think either one of was the only black person in his class to graduate from that. He was like an All-American football player at Rutgers and then went on to play in the NFL. He became, I think, the star of, I think, the longest running Broadway production at the time of Othello, and became, like you said, a theater star, and then moved into singing and was like the top singing artist and like all of these things. So the idea that he would just get kind of like hoodwinked or something and that you could just him and be like, sir, Were you brainwashed by Stalin?
Yeah.
Is extremely annoying but predictable.
Yeah, it's actually interesting in terms of, again, like Paul Robeson, like later in his life, had like serious mental health struggles that like were kind of by some speculated to have some association with like an MK type situation. But yeah, like it is interesting. Like there's one book about Paul Robeson that we came across, Paul Robeson, The Cold War Performance Complex, Race, Madness, Activism, by Tony Perucci, which is like a very performance studies-y book, but it's interesting, in its subtitle pointing out the element of madness. It really makes a strong it takes a strong emphasis on the aspect of psychoanalysis and the sort of ascendancy of psychoanalysis during Paul Robeson's time, and the way that this was used to diminish what he was saying, and the instrumentalization of sort of psychoanalytic rhetoric to say like, oh, there's something wrong with you, like you're crazy, like, or you're sort of expressing some kind of repressed thing.
It's
like,
almost a direct it's almost a direct predecessor to how people treated Kanye after 2016.
Yeah,
like,
it is similar.
Somebody needs to lock him up and get him back on his meds.
That's someone else, not to demean Paul Robeson through like comparison to modern figures,
for sure.
like as you rightly point out. But that's someone else who came to mind in reading some of this stuff as a figure who feels kind of a distances. But it is like, again, like the contrast comes through because like Kanye's political stance is like drag energy and like like I love Trump, like stuff like that, which is like you can tell there's something like under the surface like going on, or like Paul Robeson probably wouldn't be like black people were slaves because they were lazy, or like what they didn't like or like something, it's just like it kind of shows how things have changed, and like that forces that noticed Paul Robeson have marshaled themselves to, prevent another Paul Robeson from coming along. The same discourse of like, Kanye, go on your meds. It's so like naturalized now is like a direct descendant of this, and like the fact that it's so naturalized like kind of speaks to why we have sort of this incoherent situation a lot of the time in terms of the elements don't quite come together. It's true across the board of politics in the country at this point. There isn't like a well-organized left or anything, so it makes sense.
It is. You do see even the downward trajectory of basically a sort of celebrity being able to come out with like a very well thought out and compelling like political philosophy that they can speak off the cuff of. Like Robeson, this is a guy who has like done like a lot of reading and a lot of like he's steeped in like theory and praxis, and like the way he speaks about it is like so like naturally authoritative and fascinating to listen to, and like coherent. I mean, like he presents a pretty compelling case for like why he believes what he believes. Like Kanye is like entertaining, but like it's a testament maybe to how like politics in like even though it's pervaded like the pop culture entertainment complex, it is usually either like completely boilerplate or it is incoherent and not thought out.
I mean, in reading about this, and going back to this time in our readings, you really, in a certain respect, there's nothing new under the sun, because like the whole like reaction to like the idea of communism, for instance, like, and the sort of like racial element to it, like you can really see how like it's still present in certain ways, like with the sort of like the eye rolling and the sort of like, oh, you're causing like actually, I kind of think this, we mentioned the Peekskill riot, so it might be good to read like this one portion of the chapter from Perucci's book on Robeson that talks about it. Maybe we can go deeper into it later, but yeah, I'll read the prelude to it, and I'll when we get to the point that's especially relevant. So So with 1,000 state and county police on hand, the many New York City blacks and Jews who filled school buses for a September 4th concert thought themselves to be safe. Many even brought their children and a picnic lunch. In Peekskill, however, residents planned once again to disrupt the concert. Stephen Sesgo, who had rented his pasture to People's Artists for the second concert, received ongoing telephone threats. This is like in 1949, by the way. So, yeah. In addition to numerous attempts of arson to his home with Molotov cocktails, a volley of 22 rifle bullets was fired into the front wall of his house. Veterans groups planned another parade to protest Robeson's appearance, and the buses arrived at the concert area. As they arrived, the plaintive sounds of the American Legion's Fife and Drums Corps could be heard mixed in with N-words and Jews. They belong together. The Robeson concerts at Peekskill were a vivid enactment of the ways in which the violence of anti-communism and racism functioned to produce a restrictive American identity. However, the event performed violence also occasioned its resistance. The event of performed violence. As the police-enabled mobs contended, blacks and Jews did come together in Peekskill. Along with members of left-wing unions, soon to be expelled from the CIO for their radical stances and communist members, the multiple audiences of Robeson's concert, the blacks, Jews, and radicals attending the concert, and the interracial union members who created human shields directly around Robeson and another around the entire concert ground, enacted the radical stance of collective action in the face of violence. This radical action illustrates the ways in which the Cold War performance complex produces ruptures, fissures in the network of power. This is like a theoretical concept, that this guy has in this book. But anyway, the chapter describes the ways in which the performance complex conjoins activist traditions over time and across space. In the days following the second concert, Peekskill residents claimed that, once again, they had been the victims of communist provocation. However, the American Civil Liberties Union clarified how Peekskillites used the word provocation. What Peekskill means by, quote, provocation is the insistence that Robeson and his followers, by Robeson and his followers of their right to hold a private concert on private grounds in order to raise money for their unpopular political purposes. By, quote, provocation, the apologists for the Peekskill riots actually mean the exercise of the constitutional right of free speech and free assembly. Yet, many Americans saw communist speech and assembly as just such a provocation. Within the Cold War performance complex, communist provocation demanded spectacular vengeance. In the Cold War era cartoon, Make Mine Freedom, this is something that really reminded me, I think that resonates a lot today. So he's using an example of this cartoon, Make Mine Freedom. So the communist is portrayed as a snake oil salesman, quote-unquote, Mr. Utopia, who tries to con Americans into buying his, quote, foreign bottles of, quote, isms. But this is very similar to like a lot of rhetoric I think you hear going around today. But the voiceover narrator warns us that when anyone teaches disunity, tries to pit one of us against the other through class warfare, race hatred, or religious intolerance, that person seeks to rob us of our freedom and destroy our very lives, and we know what to do about it. The 100% American mob turns menacingly towards the communist con man with bottles and umbrellas held threateningly aloft. As the communist retreats, his voice lifts into profound terror. Now, gentlemen, don't throw those bottles! Don't throw those bottles! No, no! With Looney Tunes-style music, the raging mob attacks the communist, running him out of town as his screams fade into a patriotic fife and drum. In Make Mine Freedom, mob violence has become an American value. As Pete Seeger remembers, Peekskillites shared these values. The people in Peekskill were calling out to the rest of America, whenever you find a commie around, do something about it. Don't wait for the long process of the law. Do it right away, because our country is in danger. Kill a commie for mommy.
Kill a commie for mommy. Rock out in your garage. Do the Blitzkrieg bop. I also
the whole thing of like disunity, like they're tearing us apart, like with their critical race theory or whatever, their isms,
that actually directly parallels that kind of line of argument. I just watched that new Fred Hampton movie, Judas and the Black Messiah. That is exactly the argument that the FBI agent who recruits to like the snitch who ends up killing Fred Hampton basically says to him. Like I think it's actually, I know a lot of people, were saying, oh, this movie, Hollywood's gonna fucking do some bullshit and it's gonna suck. I think it's actually, anyways, he basically says like, I was down in Mississippi in '62, like hunting down the Klan. So like, I'm woke, bro. Like, the white FBI agent is saying this, and he says, but then he pivots to say, The Klan and the Panthers are just two sides of the same coin. All they want to do is divide us and like increase violence and blah blah blah, and like they're the same. Don't let Hampton fool you. You know, that's what, like, all they want is chaos and violence, and like they just want to go do Antifa stuff and like be evil. And they're no different from like Boogaloo Boys who like storm the Capitol. Really, they're all bad. And that, I guess, is kind of both the overwhelming mentality of like the national security state at that time and the like mainstream white press. Is that, you know, but like people like Robeson and the KKK were kind of just like two sides of the same coin, you know, but also there's like an implicit bias towards like downplaying the ferocity of the patriots with their fife and drums and shit, like, you know, yelling epithets and like building snipers' nests, and like a bunch of left-wing like people coming together to like have a concert, you know. And there's actually just something to piggyback off that in the same book. I think it's in the same section. It talks about the kind of erming like psychoanalytic framework from Peekskill under Peekskill and communist masochism. So I guess this was a meme at the time, and you really catch like the gaslighting vibes here. He wrote, "The national and local mainstream white press spoke with one voice about the Peekskill riot. Quote, there was, of course, no attempt to lynch Paul Robeson. Local veterans groups were victims of communist, quote, calculated incitement, displaying righteous, if misguided indignation. Ultimately, the veterans were victims of the communist psychological malady. Quote, for the communists have long been addicted to what might be called political masochism. While over 4,000 jammed the Golden Gate Ballroom in Harlem to protest the riot and to demand an investigation, the San Francisco Chronicle retorted that officials should, quote, not walk into Robeson's trap by allowing any inquiry. Quote, but it doesn't really take an investigation to discover who really touched off the riot. It only takes a little reflection as to who stood to benefit the most from such a riot, a little thought to whose bag of tricks this sort of operation generally comes out of. Robeson's appearance was an invitation to trouble, and if it wasn't deliberate on his part, it was certainly deliberate on the part of his communist friends. It was, furthermore, a smart operation on the part of the communists and sympathizers who were using Robeson, with his complete acquiescence, as a tool. And so it goes on, like, Robeson, it is clear, was the inciter of the riot. His mere appearance produced the violence it alleged to protest. The Chronicle could then make its diagnosis. Robeson was not a fool, but rather, the paper explained, a fanatic. Fanaticism was a common way to dismiss and contain communism. As Ellen Schrecker explains, this term was strategically deployed to mark communism's deviance since, quote, the depiction of communists as fanatics distanced them from ordinary people. Fanaticism implied irrationality and even madness, taking communism out of the political realm and into a world of abnormal psychology where the specific causes and ideas embraced by its members were easy to ignore. Especially among moderates and liberals, the notion that communism was some kind of psychological disorder came to be quite common. So, there you go.
And like in this respect, you can definitely see how like there's nothing new under the sun, because the same thing like happens now where like, oh, you know, even the people at Peekskill, like in 1949, like in the apogee of like lynch mania and things like that, they would say like, oh, you know, we don't have a problem with Jews, we don't have a problem with black people, you know, we have plenty of black people here, and there's even Jews here. It's because they're communists, you know, and it's the same thing now where it's like, well, you know, it's all a communist plot to like weaken our racial stock or whatever, or like, you know, or it's like, well, you know, they're promoting disunity, they're like trying to tear down America, you know,
like BLM is being like, bankrolled by Soros, and like they don't know what they're doing.
You know, it's not about that. It's about like, exactly. They're fools. They're being, you know, used in this way, like, and
useful idiots. Is a term that they love to throw around.
And therefore, like, it's okay. Like, the teleology of this, or the ultimate result, is that like our society will like collapse and we'll have no more like, you know, American identity or whatever. So therefore, like, you know, what appears to be peaceful, it's like legitimate to like react with extreme like violence,
extreme prejudice,
you know, like
basically.
There isn't a balance, because so even though like, you know, obviously this is like the absolute like, you know, the dark nadir of like, you know, racism and lynching in the American South, you know, you can still definitely see the resonances of a lot of this stuff in the way that like politics are imagined now.
I met my brother the other day. I gave him my right hand, and just as soon as ever my back was turned, he scandalized my name. Now do you call that a brother? No, no. You call that a brother? No, no. Call that a brother? No, no. Scandalize my name. I met my sister the other day. I gave her my right hand, and just as soon as ever my back was turned, she too scandalized my name. Now do you call that a sister? No, no. You call that a sister? No, no. Call that a sister? No, no. Scandalize my name. I met my preacher the other day. I gave him my right hand, and just as soon as ever my back was turned, he too scandalized my name. Now do you call that religion? No, no. You call that religion? No, no. You call that religion? No, no. Scandalize my name.
Have you ever heard of the film I Was a Communist for the FBI from 1951?
No, I have not.
Might be a fun propaganda thing to check out one day, because it's like based on a true story about, you know, an FBI informant who like infiltrated the Communist Party or whatever. In the film, which the author here quotes, like there's a scene where there's like there's a lecture at Freedom Hall, and there's a German accented communist named Eisner who is like talking to a crowd of like, you know, black workers. And I guess in the movie he says, to bring about the victory of communism in America, we must incite riots, discontent, open warfare among the people. That is the purpose of tonight's meeting. In voiceover, Svetec, the informant, explains the vulnerability of the black mind to the savvy of white communist fanaticism. And the movie says, yes, as Gerhard Eisner said, Pittsburgh was too quiet, too peaceful, so they cooked up a hell brew of hate from a recipe written in the Kremlin. It was the same old line they'd used for years on all racial minorities to create unrest and confusion. Like other communist traitors, Blandin, the communist lecturer, had been trained in Moscow. There are more ways than one to sabotage the safety of a country. The one he used was as dangerous as blowing up defense plants. It was the old rule of divide and conquer. Literally nothing new.
The Hegelian dialectic.
Hegelian dialectic.
Right.
You know, I guess the African American crowd performs its quote mental inability to resist the sway of communist fanaticism by wildly applauding the communist speaker and shouting down the lone dissenter. But communist advocacy of civil rights in the film is purely a cynical ploy to get one of that crowd to get into a fight with a white man and ... kill him. And in fact, in the movie, communists are shown to be even more racist than the FBI agent among them. Upon his return giving his riot inciting lecture, Blandin declares, quote, "Those N-words ate it up, didn't they?" So that was the vibe in Hollywood in 1951 during the Red Scare. And I mean, but like, how similar does that sound both to like the things right-wing people would say and also to like Russiagate liberals of you know, cooked up a, like, I could see what's her name, like Sarah Kendzior or something, like tweeting like they cooked up a hell brew of hate from a recipe written in the Kremlin.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, like it's not just like, of course right-wing people are like the heaviest handed with it, but it absolutely like comes from liberals. I feel like recently, maybe since George Floyd, there's been a little bit of like quieter, or the liberal side of that has been cowed, but maybe now that Biden is in office, you know, because of the way these things work, where it's completely superficial and cynical, like we'll start to see the liberal brand of it like emerge more forcefully again, where it's like, this is all about like, you know, or the sort of concerned trolling of like, well, you know,
exactly.
Like, by like, I remember like the concern
like
about
Bernie
like,
in
Russia,
2016.
You know,
Yeah,
or
like Bernie Bros were basically useful idiot.
Exactly. Yes, disinformation.
Yeah, Jill Stein as well, deeply misguided, dangerous anti-vaxxer. Had dinner with Putin once. Total asset. Yeah. And so that it shows you how deep that DNA of like the anti-communist like state of mind permeates like both wings of American politics and like political discourse, and like what the way the media is able to dismiss and demean and basically like slander, people that are saying something that's like out of line, that goes against the orthodoxy.
This is actually an amazing example from that same book that I wanted to read earlier. I think now might be a good time. So this is a very great anecdote about his meeting with President Truman, Robeson meeting with President Truman. So Panucci says, Perucci. In the years leading up to the Peekskill riots, Robeson led a delegation to meet with President Harry Truman to demand his advocacy for federal anti-lynching legislation. The Robeson-Truman meeting garnered national attention due not only to Robeson's celebrity, but also due to the combative turn the meeting took. Robeson and other activists demanded action in the face of the resurgence of lynch terror, which had been met with not a single arrest, indictment, or conviction of any participant in any of the lynchings. The Chicago Defender reported that when Harper Sibley, president of the United Council of Church Women, compared fascism against Jews in Germany to fascism in America against Negroes, the president showed impatience and a flare of temper. Truman continued to assert the primary significance of, quote, patience as a long-term political strategy over immediate action. Robeson finally warned Truman that if the federal government refused to act to curb lynching, Negroes would. Truman responded by shaking his fist, stating that this sounded like a threat. Indeed, this notion of the true danger of racism dominated American political cultural discourse throughout the post-war years. Racism was not thought to threaten democracy by the violence and discrimination that constituted it. Rather, racism's true threat was seen as the potential violence against whites that it might incur from African Americans, as well as the propaganda value such conflicts would have for the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the consequences of racism for African Americans were continually elided.
I could completely imagine President Biden like saying that today to somebody who went into his office.
Listen, fat, that sounds like a threat.
Exactly. Here's the deal. Right. Get out. Get out of my office.
Now listen, Jack. I've done more for
it's like he starts having corn pop flashbacks and like reaches for a chain under his desk and like wraps it around his hand and the aides escort them out.
Chest. Yeah, definitely. I can see it happening.
Yeah, so,
I think that's still very true, that the real danger is what could happen, to white people if this racism, if black people, if this racism gets so extreme that black people get mad, what could happen to, Coca-Cola or whatever, or Bank of America if we don't make a perfunctory sign of
it shows you again to the aspects of performativity that permeate all of this, that Truman was much more concerned with the appearance of the United States not being racist than he was about the actual realities of racist violence in the United States. He was just concerned about the Soviets wouldn't be able to point to something that was an actual result of our basically apartheid society, and the violence that springs from that, and get basically we would rightfully look bad and they would point it out, and that's priority number one, is to basically look like you're doing something, but at the same time, when you say this will inevitably erupt into something worse if you don't do anything about it, he immediately thinks of why are you threatening me?
And Paul Robeson
there's a disconnect there.
Part of the reason why Paul Robeson was such a lightning rod, I think, is because he combined in one person the fear of the agitation for civil rights by African Americans and the fear of communists. They basically created he embodied the conflation of those two things. One feeds into the other, and so I think
while being one of America's most beloved celebrities. is that had to be a little terrifying for you know,
and it's very
J.
interesting
Edgar
too, like if you think about the nature. I mean, like I think that you mentioned Old Man River, like which is probably like maybe his most famous song. Like I think that his like nickname for a while was like Old Man River Robeson or whatever, you know, like the people
Old
love
Man
that.
River,
which is, you know, of course. And the song Old Man River itself, like in its lyrics, like Paul Robeson actually refused to sing like the lyrics as they were written. Like he had like kind of a beef with the guy who wrote them, the famous Hammerstein of Hammerstein. He was like, Robeson could write his own song and stop changing my lyrics. Like he has to say the N-word and like, you know, be like, it's stupid, like, you know, in the lyrics.
He had some lyrics that I guess or some songs that was like had the N-word.
I mean, Old Man River is. Yeah, you know what? There's actually another interesting part about like this song from the same book. Like, and it kind of like I think the point I'm trying to make is how it's very interesting how like Paul Robeson sort of roles, like his role in that movie Showboat, which itself is like Showboat is like a very like bizarre like
stereotypical.
You know, at the time it was like groundbreaking for being at the time like, and by at the time I mean like 1929 I think was when it first came
36.
out.
It was 36.
There wasn't an earlier version of that, or
well, the movie was in 36. The musical, I think, he wasn't in the musical. Yeah, no, he was in the musical in the late 20s, and then in the movie in 36 he didn't want to do it, but his wife told him he should just go in there and offer like a ridiculous sum of money, like basically demand a ridiculous sum of money they would say no to, and then they said yes. So then he was like, all right, I'll do it. Yeah, but
this movie is basically about like miscegenation and like you know, the plot line is kind of like this melodramatic like saccharine kind of things, like sort of creating sympathy for people of color, at least for the sort of I guess the stereotype is like the tragic octoroon. Like you is like sort of a figure at the time, especially like the sort of attractive like basically white woman who like finds out that she has like a tiny little like fraction of black blood, and therefore like this poor white woman has to like suffer the plight of like, you know, being treated as black. And this was like, you know, one of the main ways that white people were able to like sympathize with black people by seeing like, oh, you know, like, wow, these rules really are unfair because like a poor white, you know, a beautiful white woman.
It's very much like that, you know, that book that I think I actually had to read in high school, but it's probably like highly canceled today. I think it was called Black Like Me, where a guy basically painted like dressed up in blackface in New Orleans for like a year and was like, wow, like I did not realize that like the racism is bad, like damn, you know. Kind of a controversial tactic today, but I guess that's kind of what maybe it took back then for people to even be able to imagine.
I mean, it's kind of like Uncle Tom's Cabin, like, you know, Harriet Beecher Stowe like didn't know any, like had never met a slave or like had never talked to a black person or something, you know, and like the old school Uncle Tom's Cabin is full of like racist stereotypes, but like it really did a lot to help like white people like see like, oh, this is like wrong, you know.
Well, it's like, very much like there's even modern movies today, like and like whatever, like you know, like the movies like the movies like The Help, you know.
The Help is a great example. For sure.
Or you know, being an inner city like school teacher or something who inspires these kids, and you know, like all those kind of like movies. I didn't see the movie
Green Book, but I heard similar things about it.
But he felt very constricted by these roles. It should be said, like he always had
his role in it was not like an active role. Like the main character of Showboat is the tragic octoroon, really, who is like, you know, this white woman who's cursed kind of by this drop of black blood that destroys her life, because even a lot of the white people around her are like, oh, you know, we know it's not fair, but like we have to enforce the laws. No one would ever think that about like Paul Robeson's character, who is like Joe, the black stevedore, who like sits there and like muses about Old Man River and like accepts his plight, you know, but it's interesting how like he was someone who embodied those roles and those characters for like the imagination of white audiences, and then, you know, the way he was able to use that as like a weapon, like a political weapon, is like super interesting.
And he did I think his son in the like 1999 PBS documentary Here I Stand, which is really good, you can find it on YouTube. I think he did say at a point that like Paul Robeson would always tell him that art is a weapon. And that was how he approached basically every career that he like catapulted to the top of in his life. He taught as basically like a field of struggle, basically. That it wasn't just about kind of like being good at the thing, but in many cases he was like one of the first black people to be able to do a thing, and it was all about like, what could I do to sort of like advance the cause of my people by becoming a football star? Like, what could I do by becoming like, going to Columbia and becoming a lawyer to like, help basically. And for a while, it does say in the documentary that back in the 1920s, when he really was kind of definitely a celebrity among African Americans already was kind of a sports star. He believed in kind of what is, I think, still very dominant I would say almost like monopolizes the ideas today in terms of advancement of like individuals. Basically, if enough individual African Americans distinguish themselves in their various fields, that it will like basically disprove racism. It'll discredit the sort of white supremacist ideas that permeate everything in our society. And then basically white America will have to like yield and like basically start to integrate. But of course, over his once he still wasn't super like politically plugged in the early 1920s. As he got more like politically educated, he started to greatly resent that kind of framing. That if you just like basically, I mean, even to the point where when he's in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee in the 50s, when they yell at him about like, but you were a football star, like you've been very successful, like nobody stood in your way, and he really like claps back against that very hard. It's like, I deeply like resent and like disagree with the idea that like a few exceptional Negroes, becoming at the top of their industry means that like it automatically, like a rising tide lifts all boats for everybody, or everybody else like rides into my coattails. He realized that it was much more structural and class based, and like the problems ran way deeper. So he never, and now today it's kind of like, well, like, bro, look at Jay-Z, like he's a businessman.
Well, no, yeah, exactly.
It's like,
there's also a great like there's nothing new under the sun moment, because like people are still saying stuff, but it's amazing that like even back then, like those HUAC members would be like screaming at him that there's no racism in America. In like,
I saw you play football at Lehigh. There was no color prejudice against you then. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Like what? Like like it's
psychotic.
Really, really insane.
But the level, I mean, I assume some of the people, I don't know the exact composition of the HUAC committees, but I assume some of them were like they weren't all like the most far right, like hardcore. There must have been some people that fancied themselves like responsible liberals who maybe, cared about the Negro, situation or whatever, but would still, I think, would be pretty much like, they probably mostly agreed with that like psycho who's like screaming about the Lehigh game he saw Paul Robeson play in.
If people look up his thing on YouTube, like they'll find kind of the James Earl Jones like reenactment where like it's very much like kind of like courtroom, like it's kind of, I think it might be done up a little bit, with
might
the
be,
intensity of the people screaming, but I
do, we could talk about that
in reality, but
it might have been. I have to say, I thought for the last several years, you told me that today, that it was James Earl Jones, and that kind of blew my mind a little bit, because I listened to that the last couple years, and I consider it kind of one of the most like, I considered it, I think I even told this to people, like this is one of the greatest performances like in American history, even though it's it's Paul Robeson testifying to this committee in a very hostile back and forth, but just like his level of, and I didn't question for a second, partially I guess because James Earl Jones's impression is so accurate that you almost can't tell, but like also if you look at other things of Paul Robeson talking or being interviewed or testifying, like that is how he is just so performative by nature, and as a public figure, like the the event itself was so theatrical that I didn't even question listening to this recording online that was actually like James Earl Jones doing a one-man play. And I think you did say that like there are a few things that were kind of changed or inserted. Yeah. Most of it is pretty accurate. They have the transcript, but I guess no audio recording. I just want to say something that popped into my head.
Yeah.
I believe the version that I had found and that I had like shared with you was actually posted by, I just want to double check here. Actually, this link is a little different. As interpreted by James Earl Jones. This link does mention at the bottom that this is like a recreation. But the original version that I found, the reason I was misled is because it didn't label it as like James Earl Jones doing it, but it was posted by Jacobin. And I just thought, not to get a little too paranoid, but thought it was interesting because one of the things that is like downplayed in this like 11-minute clip that from the real transcript was Paul Robeson's much more robust defense of Stalin and the gulags than basically he gives. He does defend kind of Stalin and like deflects the questions when they attack him in the James Earl Jones thing, but just thought kind of interesting that like Jacobin would kind of try to like maybe psyop us into thinking that, you know, that was all Paul Robeson said about the Soviet Union, but he actually like went further, maybe into like tanky territory a little bit.
And like the real transcript I think is much longer in general, but what he does sort of say like you know, they make this whole point because Paul Robeson is sort of indicting the United States for its complicity in slavery and all of these things, and so they're like, well, what about the slave camps in the Soviet Union? And you know, in the recording he just kind of repeats his point that like there's nothing comparable to like the, you know, the way that the United States has been built on slavery, you know, kind of artfully deflecting it. In the actual transcript, he says something which is like, you know, I don't like, basically like, you know, he makes the point that, you know, he'll take that up with the Russian people, like that's their problem, like he's not Russian, he's American, he doesn't have the ability to affect that, but as he understands it, the people in those camps are fascists, you know, like so like, you know, and they would kill like a bunch of Jews and black people if they had the chance, so that's what he says he understands it, you know, so
necessary, it was necessary,
not in the recording.
Which, you know, that I think that's evident both that like maybe in this one-man play James Earl Jones did, that was a part they wanted to tone down a little bit, and that Jacobin is trying to psyop us all into thinking that, you know, Paul Robeson only gave like a little bit of a softer defense of the Soviets, and they did because they're like trots or the sock dem opportunists. But anyways,
in Russia, I felt for the first time like a full human being. No color prejudice like in Mississippi, no color prejudice like in Washington. It was the first time I felt like a human being, where I did not feel the pressure of color as I feel it in this committee today.
Why do you not stay in Russia?
Because my father was a slave, and my people died to build this country. And I'm going to stay here and have a part of it just like you, and no fascist-minded people will drive me from it. Is that clear?
You are here because you are promoting the communist cause.
I am here because I'm opposing the neo-fascist cause, which I see arising in these committees. Jefferson could be sitting here, and Frederick Douglass could be sitting here. Eugene Debs could be sitting here.
Now, what prejudice are you talking about? You were graduated from Rutgers. You were graduated from the University of Pennsylvania. I remember seeing you play football at Lehigh. There was no prejudice against you.
Just a moment. This is something I challenge very deeply, that the success of a few Negroes can make up for $700 a year for thousands of Negro families in the South. My father was a slave, and I have cousins who are sharecroppers. I do not see success in terms of myself. I have sacrificed hundreds of thousands of dollars for what I believe in.
While you were in Moscow, Mr. Robeson, did you make a speech lauding Stalin?
I can't remember.
Have you recently changed your mind about Stalin?
Stalin, gentlemen, is a question for the Soviet Union, and I won't argue with a representative of the people who, in building America, wasted the lives of my people. You are responsible, you and your forebears, for 60 to 100 million black people dying in the slave ships and on the plantations. Don't you ask me about anybody.
I'm sure you wouldn't want to discuss with us the slave labor camps in the Soviet Union.
Nothing could be built more on slavery than this society, I assure you.
I would invite your attention to the Daily Worker of June 29, 1949, with reference to a get-together with you and Ben Davis, formerly communist councilman in New York. Do you know Ben Davis?
One of my dearest friends. He is as patriotic an American as can be, and you, gentlemen, are the non-patriots.
Just a minute.
You are the un-Americans.
The hearing is now adjourned.
I think it should be.
I've been doing all of this that I can.
Can I read my statement?
No! The meeting is adjourned.
It should be.
Before we get into like a more like linear bio of Paul Robeson, I thought that these two parts from Perucci's book stood out to me. There's one section, we won't read the whole thing, but it's called The Black Paranoid Poetics and the Cold War Crisis of Sanity. It's, this whole book is very theory brain, so, just take it as you will. But anyway, so he writes, perpetual crisis limits what kinds of performances are permissible, formally contributing to the ideology of scarcity. However, crisis is also a productive force, as Randy Martin points out, in that performance can be said to occur through crisis as well as from crisis. Just as HUAC needed Robeson to, quote, act like a communist so that he could serve as an object of repudiation for other blacks, his actual occupation of that position gave rise to a critique of U.S. post-war foreign policy, civil rights, and economic practices, and thus threatened to reveal that HUAC and other anti-communist forces were operating as a means to undo New Deal programs. These anti-communist moves were enacted not out of a free market ideology, but rather were meant to facilitate government-corporate partnerships to expand global capitalism. Robeson's performance, rather than ritually interpolating him as an obedient citizen, a little Althusser reference there, reclaimed the space of performance as a site to demand the redress of the violence of slavery, racism, and capitalism, or at least inhibit their perpetuation. This part goes a little bit into sort of the idea of critical paranoia, which I like, and sort of the pathologization of this. The mode of radical black performance is repeatedly diagnosed as mentally ill and subject to confinement. A disproportionate percentage of patients who are involuntarily committed to state-run institutions in the U.S. are black. Black patients were more frequently subjected to sedative medicine and held in greater numbers for indefinite confinement without juridical review. Those who have narrated links between such practices with a drive to, quote, sterilize mental defectives, who raised awareness about the CIA's alleged involvement with crack dealing in Los Angeles and the assassination of Congolese leader Patrice Lumumba, or who called attention to the links between corporate interests in Africa and U.S. foreign policy, have repeatedly been labeled as paranoid. This is something we've kind of talked about a little bit before. Quote, black paranoia has been used to discount assertions of racist practices in the U.S. government. As Patricia Turner has argued in her study of rumor and folklore in African American culture, the vast accounting of state-sponsored and state-sanctioned violence against blacks means that such thinking is not paranoid, but is rather entirely reasonable and in perfect keeping with traditional anti-black hostility once found in many branches of government. However, if we consider paranoia less as a clinical disorder than as a social practice where, quote, one's interpretations seem to be unfounded or abnormal to an interpretive community, unquote, then the paranoia can be seen to occupy a position of radical critique. It is in this position that Joseph Heller's paranoid bomber occupies in Catch-22. He believes that everyone is trying to kill him because they actually are. As a position of radical critique, creative and critical paranoia can serve as an effective form of resistance to social control. The post-war narrative of paranoia conspiracy, according to Timothy Melly, is driven by a sense that knowledge and power are inextricably linked, and that to be paranoid may only be to reject the normalizing ideology of the powerful. If we see critical paranoia as a social practice that operates as a form of political resistance rather than as a clinical diagnosis, then we need not, as Patricia Turner does, dispense with the term. Instead, we can adopt critical paranoia as a political strategy of making visible the performance complex, the connectedness of state-sponsored and state-sanctioned oppression, manifested by the violence of physical force or the violence of economic domination and exploitation.
Wow.
Yeah,
hell yeah. Full-throated endorsement of critical paranoia.
Yeah, definitely.
It's what we've been saying this whole time.
Yes, it's what we've been saying this whole yeah, definitely true. But yeah, he goes on to talk about Robeson's embodiment of this through his voice and his performance. One great thing that, he was accused of kind of making up was the influence of African traditions on like black music, which is, you know, they were saying like, oh, you know, his association of these different like you know, his sort of random association of these different cultures and something to do with each other, you know, that shows like you know, that he's moving towards a mental breakdown or something. This is the part. For Robeson, the burning voice of revolt was characterized by a radical linking that also characterized critical paranoia, which was, in fact, a theory for a total system that underlies all folk expression. During his confinement, Robeson began to research to develop a musicological paradigm that would, according to Tim Chopin's recounting of a speech Robeson gave at Swarthmore College, illumine how peace has a cultural basis. In his writings and speeches on music, Robeson argued that there is a world body, a universal body of folk music based upon a universal pentatonic 5-tone scale. A little bit of getting here.
Yeah, I did point that out in the notes that like the pentatonic scale is Robeson's basically his Verdi tuning, but actually there's a lot to it actually, and it's really fascinating. Like he was a real music theory nerd basically throughout his life.
I mean, he was an amazing like, you know, musical performer and artist. So, you know, perhaps it was a bit more credits than LaRouche.
No, I mean, absolutely. It's not
LaRouche's musical accomplishments too much, but
but in terms of like the depth of his passion for it, it's like just on that level of like he really dove into trying to find like Chomsky, but for real, like almost trying to find like the universal source of like all folk music around the world, like the certain building blocks, like the pentatonic scale, which you can achieve by basically, he explains in his book Here I Stand very straightforwardly that if you just go on a piano and you only play on the black keys, that's the pentatonic scale. And if you actually start playing around with that, like so many folk melodies do sound like that across very different culture. I don't know. It's fascinating. Anyways.
Yeah, this is just interesting. Robeson had initially looked to the pentatonicism as a way to refute suggestions that African-American musical traditions were imitations of European musical forms. Afro-American music, with its emphasis on the polyphonic and contrapuntal, was based on the pentatonic scale, which he argued in 1956 had a, quote, African heritage. But Robeson extended his claim to argue for a universal tonality that linked folk cultures. A pentatonic harmony united China, Africa, Indonesia, and up until 1500, Europe. Robeson biographer Martin Doberman dismisses Robeson's findings by saying that pentatonic universalism as, quote, a discovery is as indisputable as it is unoriginal. Moreover, Doberman reads Robeson's, quote, obsessive investment with pentatonism as evidence of his imminent mental breakdown. Doberman insists that Robeson's rattling on about similarities between seemingly disparate cultures proved him to be manic and compulsive.
Wow, fuck you, Doberman. Wow.
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly. I haven't looked at the footnotes to see when that biography was written, but you know, sometimes you'd be surprised about like how recent these insane things like were published. But like
he definitely listens to his music at 440 hertz.
Yeah, definitely, as recommended by Gehring or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah, but but I mean, of course, like as Perucci does rightly point out, like he kind of failed to recognize the political dimension of that, which is like creating, you know, kind of we talked about in the past with Malcolm X, like at the time of his death, you know, a move towards solidarity, you know, with other cultures, you know, other sort of non-European cultures.
He writes that it's no coincidence that Robeson highlighted China, Africa, and Indonesia in his theory of musical universalism because those were the sites of intense contestation during the Cold War conflict. Exactly, right?
Right, yeah. So, and, you know, this section also talks about, like, you know, again, some pretty performance theory brain stuff, you know, where he talks about, like, how his voice was, like, a form of resistance, again, like the psychoanalytic framework of this HUAC trial is trying to sort of get, because his whole theory is that there's like there's of course a theatricality to HUAC, but there's also an anti-theatricality to it because it's trying to sort of enforce its own idea, it's you know, so its own image or its own framing of the truth. And Robeson, like being a performer, inherently like resists that because he has like the knowledge to sort of subvert it, and you know, like it creates like the anxiety that like, oh, you know, we can't tell like what he really means, you know, we need to access his internal state, but because, you know, he can act, or that's the rest of this section.
He says in the he says in the introduction basically that it was also, I mean, it was in a very like real way targeted at people in the entertainment industry. So in a way, it was like being an actor became a shifty occupation that basically had all these connections to, you know, not just communism, but all, you know, homosexuality and like, you know, moral degeneracy and all these other things. And so they were almost trying to like, but which I was like doubly ironic because they're basically bringing in these actors to put on a performance to like denounce people or name names and, you know, tear at their garments and denounce communism. So they were putting on, kind of like anti-theatrical theater. And then Robeson came and refused to like basically participate in that theater and countered with his own theater. And it just became like an arena of theatrical warfare.
Yes, true. Yeah, and like I think you're right that like it's not just anti-theatrical like theoretically, but also they were like literally targeting actors and performers and like cultural workers. So that does make sense. And this one other section that comes a bit later is called "Mixing Old Man River with Old Man Marx." You know, which talks a little bit about that song as we sort of mentioned. He writes, Robeson had long needed to fight for audiences to understand his performances of Negro spirituals and work songs as voicings of protest and resistance, as they were at peak skill, instead of the helpless resignation white concert audiences had tended to see in them. White audiences had long accepted the idea of blackness as an abject condition and believed that African Americans accepted second-class status as inevitable. Robeson was dismayed at white audiences' ability to read resistance out of his performances of spirituals and to read resignation into them. As early as 1935, Robeson felt that he could find little audience for what he was trying to do in performance, since white audiences want Negro religious songs from which they take not the suffering, but the comfort of the resignation they express. You know, you can get...
That is a dynamic that definitely still plays out today, like the sort of, even in Hollywood and everything, kind of like the... I mean, I think 12 Years a Slave would probably qualify. Like it's more like there's somehow this like white gaze like worms itself into it, and it ends up being more about like making the white liberals who are watching it on the coasts like feel really good, and but also like through this weird resignation thing, like it's like, oh, it's just that old man river, it just keeps rolling on, you know, what are we gonna do? Can't do anything.
The connection between like the kind of integrationist like sentimentalism and like the abolitionist even sentimentalism, you know, is definitely something you can see like a trajectory to the sort of white liberal anti-racism of today. This is a good sentence. Saida Hartman traces this perception of black performance to the widely circulated tracts describing slave coffles by white northern abolitionists. In what Hartman calls, quote, the violence of identification, white audiences describe the hearing of slave songs as a projection of empathy, wherein blackness, rather than enslavement, is constituted as the abject condition. Definitely something that you can see now. This identification was based not on proximity and communality, but on maintaining and extending boundaries of difference. One abolitionist explained that, quote, the best way to take the Negroes into your heart is to get as far away from them as possible, end quote. And yet such was the power of black song that it continued not only to sustain and mobilize African Americans under slavery, but also serve as testimonials to the brutality of the slave system to northern audiences. So it goes on to talk about the performance in Peekskill in particular. So but in the 1930s, Robeson began to craft his performances to deliberately emphasize his activist tradition of black music. By using a percussive singing style to counterpoint the deep, round tones of his basso voice, Robeson enacted the historical legacy of black resistance as a means of political organization that imagined community with other exploited peoples. When I sing, this is a quote from him, "Let my people go," it must express the need for freedom not only of my own race, that's only part of a bigger thing, but of all the working class, here in America all over. I was born of them. They are my people. They will know what I mean. Robeson began his Peekskill performance by singing Let My People Go, perhaps the best-known protest song of all Negro spirituals. He concluded his short set with a rendition of Old Man River, for which he is probably best known. Richard Dyer has called Oscar Hammerstein's Old Man River, quote, the ultimate white person spiritual. Hammerstein's song differs from the popular blackface performances that still dominated Broadway during the 1930s by acknowledging the materiality of black suffering and the sentience of black people. However, it recapitulates the idea of blackness as an expression of abjectivity and of resignation as a traditional African-American response. So Robeson refused to sing the opening line as written, which is N-words all work on the Mississippi. Yeah. So Hammerstein changed it to There's an Old Man Called the Mississippi. This change, however, does not displace the opening stanza's establishment of the singer's desire to occupy the position of whiteness, define the song as a condition of being free of worries, world problems. Moreover, the rapid tempo of the song and the resilience of white listeners' interpretive practices left audience with reaffirmation of the stereotypes of African Americans as lazy and complacent. One review of an early recording of the song by Robeson, performed with Paul Whitman's orchestra, reveals the ways in which racism overdetermined white hearings of the song. To anyone who knows the southern states, Paul Robeson singing Old Man River will conjure up quite an unforgettable picture. The hot sun beating on colored folk, lolling at their ease, or even stretched out fast asleep. And it takes a Negro to be able to sleep in the full glare of a subtropical sun. Somewhere, so you can see, imagine like Paul Robeson like reading this and just losing his, somewhere a banjo is heard. Slowly, sleepily, the whole gathering takes up the tune. Someone claps their hands. There is a shuffling of feet. A young buck, N-word, rouses himself and breaks into a dance. Another joins him. Soon the quay is alive with dancing, gesticulating figures. The player, tired, puts his hand over the strings to still the last throbbing chord. The dancers stop with a jerk. Men and women sink to the ground almost where they stood, and once more the quayside sleeps. Yeah.
That is some like perverse like Nancy Pelosi wearing a dashiki energy. Like, oh God.
Yeah, for sure. Right. Yes. But, so Robeson started to change the song because he was so famous for it. You know, he started to make his, improvisations. So at peak skill, as he had done many times before, he recast the figure of Old Man River as a greedy and exploitative capitalist, clarifying in his new opening, "That's the old man I don't want to be." Moreover, Robeson's response to the exploitation described in the song is not the melancholic lot envisioned by Hammerstein, jailed for drinking. Rather, Robeson articulates the imprisoned African Americans as political prisoners. You show a little grit and you get in jail.
Exactly.
Yeah, instead of you drink a
I was
little
just listening to I have an old vinyl record of I think like his last record, which is like his farewell concert in Carnegie Hall in '58. And on that rendition of Old Man River, he's got the fire lyrics, like the new ones that he put in there. So he was able to basically like recapture or insert, like reframe it as a radical song, basically, even though it started out as something that was like very problematic. Like the ultimate white man spiritual, he was able to like take it back and reclaim it basically, and then give it this like basically in this beautiful way that I think is like it's like I love that about Robeson, that he used art basically, and even used like quite kind of hostile materials, and also like viewed his position in society as like, okay, this is my number one hit, what do I do with it? And made it into a song that merged the ideas of like the civil rights struggle and the labor struggle thematically in like a perfect way that still preserved, like everyone would still be like, yeah, Old Man River, but like he put these like subtle twists on it that embody like what he actually wants to say, like very deftly and perfectly. Like it's very impressive.
Old Man River went from being like, well, that's just the way things are, to being like, the systemic forces that like he'll fight against. Like he changed it from like, I'm scared of dying to like I must keep fighting until I'm dying.
Until I'm dying. Yep, that's right. Yeah, and he sings it with such conviction. It's like better. It's definitely an improvement, like a huge improvement just on a basic aesthetic level. It's more defiant,
and and the fact of knowing like what it was like makes it even more powerful. And of course, like people got like super mad. Speaking of white liberals, they got furious.
Really?
This is what Perucci says. He recounts some of this stuff. By asserting the will to fight until death against the intransigent Old Man River, Robeson signals the link to potential ambushers of American racial order. By showing himself to be, quote, mad, his performances threatened to, quote, infect his listeners with a particular brand of madness. Long before peak skill, Robeson's version of the song was thought to infect listeners with his madness. Robeson's performances of the song were celebrated for the, quote, provocation they could have had upon white listeners' mental stability. There was something about his voice that was almost alarming. Those who listened to this performance simply went out of their minds. Robeson was roundly attacked in the press for his racialization of this white person's spiritual. The New Yorker contended that it was when Robeson radicalized his performance that he became an enemy of the state, complaining that when Robeson mixes Old Man River with Old Man Marx, he is being unfair to the Mississippi and is playing fast and loose. He's playing fast and loose with the Negro race for whom he purports to speak. Robeson lost, quote, the people as an audience when he began to make pronouncements that were largely unpopular.
This is exactly, I know it's like a little bit different, but this is the exact same energy of everybody like erming Brian De Palma for making Redacted and calling it a war crime. Like, sorry, sir, you lost us. Or Busta Rhymes.
Yeah, erming Busta Rhymes for saying that like Bohemian Grove is real or something like that.
Exactly. Or somebody saying that like the Bilderberg Group has meetings. Like, excuse me.
Wait, you think that's real?
I just wanted to like piggyback real off that, because also I think you mentioned it in there that like he was his spreading of like this version of the song was seen as like a virus or a pathogen. Just thought it would be like relevant for today, because Perucci makes this allusion a number of times throughout the book. In this one quote, he says, these theoretical and performance praxis that constitute the resistive and ruptural elements of the Cold War performance complex understand race and racism as material linked to capitalist exploitation of labor that must be resisted through political and social means, rather than simply adjusted to by the psychoanalytic rhetoric that came to dominate liberal anti-racist discourse. And yet Robeson was condemned by Peekskillite anti-communists and their defenders for having vocally spread a contagious pathogen that gave its victims communist, quote, madness. This infectious invasion that Robeson was thought to embody operated as a justification of mob violence against the largely black and Jewish concertgoers. He mentions that a number of times, that he was viewed as like this kind of like mental contagion that needed to be managed almost in like a public health way. That was how a lot of like liberal anti-communists would kind of spin and take it to criticize Robeson, and which is not that far from kind of the portrayal of like I was a communist for the FBI, where these like ultra cynical communists are just like lying to black folks and and then like calling them the N-word behind the closed doors and like laughing about how they're just manipulating everybody with
Yeah, this quote from the Peekskill Evening Star is a great example of what you're talking about. It says, the present days seem to be crucial ones for the residents of this area with the present epidemic of polio. Now we are being plagued by another, namely the appearance of Paul Robeson and his communistic followers. It is an epidemic because they are coming here to induce others to join their ranks, and it is unfortunate that some of the weaker-minded are susceptible to their fallacious teachings unless something is done by the loyal Americans of this area.
Wow. I love how that's the exact like inversion of the like racism is like the real virus of 2020. It's like no, like you think polio is a virus, like communist infiltration is the real virus of 1951. Or something like that. Like,
as we talked about like with Dark Winter, like it's the same sort of like thing where the crisis situation that justifies like the HUAC stuff or the the riots, like that is maintained by this idea, like the epidemic makes it okay, the idea of like the disease, like these weaker-minded people are going to be susceptible. I even remember like there's this dude Bernard of Clairvaux, I believe, like who was like a 12th century Catholic priest or something, who was like a big crusade booster. And I remember him saying something like, when you kill a Muslim, it's not really a homicide, it's a malicide. You're killing evil. And like if you do that, that's okay, because it's necessary to stop like the spread of this like shadow from like going over like other people and possibly making their souls be endangered, so
they're just like they're NPCs caught in the Islamo matrix, and it's okay to kill them.
It's justified, because like if Islam spreads, then the scepter of evil will be upon like all these poor people's souls, so therefore,
they won't really be living anyway. They're already dead in a way.
I guess it's really a classic thing, you know, a perennial thing of like dehumanization. But
but that sounds very similar to like the way that people would talk about communists is like, well, they're all brainwashed, so like you might just have to kill them all because they're just automatons. Like, you know, they've given up their humanity by indulging in this you know, evil philosophy.
Zombie plague of like insects. Or so,
absolutely. You know, instead of reckoning with the idea that anybody could find like value in sort of Marxism or socialist politics or the countries that were like implementing socialism in the 20th century, this sneaky little way of just medicalizing and pathologizing the appeal for, you know, very material thing. I mean, to say to like an African American in like the 50s that you must be mentally ill if you want to like, if you admire a society where like racism is illegal and people are running around like firebombing churches and like lynching people around you and you're a complete second class citizen, like just the gall of that. But I mean, it definitely worked, I think, especially in regards to like white liberals of that time, in terms of like giving them an excuse to basically like it's taking an inherently political problem and like medicalizing it, just like what they would do with like, you know, pandemics today or any other number of things, or like the Dark Winter. They're taking like what is really like even like a bioterror attack is like a political, fundamentally, like it's a political crisis, right? You're like somebody attacked you probably for like political reasons.
Many aspects of what we're witnessing now, like the pandemic, even though obviously it is a medical issue, like there's many political dimensions to it that like aren't like engaged properly. And in fact, like the aspect of the pandemic is a great way to like put this pall of like, you know, a medical crisis over like all politics, and to put all politics within the arena of, like you mentioned, like, you know, when
trust the science,
the anti-racism protests, it has to be like, well, you know, racism is also a public health emergency. Like, all right, sure, but like it's all like kind of like a political, like why is
they're
everything
intermingling these two things?
Like chill, like, you know, it's just like
there
you have to put this somehow into the framework of this like medical thing. But also, like, it's very interesting how you can almost see, like, the superficiality of, like, the whole thing of, like, liberalism versus communism, or, like, the individuality. Like, you know, Paul Robeson in his HUAC testimony even said, like, you know, in Russia, you know, and to be fair, like, as we said, like, they probably rolled the red carpet for him and everything, like, but he said, like, you know, in Russia, I felt like, you know, I was a man, you know, I didn't feel colored prejudice, I felt like, you know, I was, like, he felt like his full self, you know? And if you're mentally ill, then, like, you're not yourself, you know? That's something that it goes all the way back to, it predates the, like, you know, of course, with communism and capitalism, like, the way that it's framed is very much like individualism versus collectivism, you know? But that, like, fear, like, goes way back before communism, like, was a thing. It's all, like, an old thing where it's, like, all the, you know, the liberal individual, or even like the, you know, the Christian subject or something, like, versus like these hordes of homogenized, you know, people who aren't themselves and who are like one body. It's like, you know, it shows the superficiality of this thing where, like, oh, if you're communist, then like, again, like, it seems more facile in a way, because there is like an aspect of solidarity and, like, you know, collectivism in communism, but like the polemic against it really, like, you know, the idea that, like, oh, you have to give up your individuality, like, you know.
Well, there was actually, in one of the radio interviews I listened to him on our favorite public radio station, KPFK, I think in 1958, in a segment called Paul Robeson Speaks. I think during that interview, I think it was like the director of KPFK, I think his name is Harold Winkler. He posed a kind of interesting question to Robeson, and of course this is like Pacifica Radio, so they are kind of relatively, while they are like not communists themselves, like they're out there in Oakland and they're very like sympathetic to him compared to everybody else. But Harold Winkler asks him, you know, like, when I was over in Europe a little while ago, I met a member of the French Communist Party, and he told me that in order for us to progress to like the next, stage of human civilization, to like socialism, which he believes is necessary, he believed that he said, I am giving up my freedom now to certain individuals who are going to lead the way, and so that my children and grandchildren can have like true freedom. And he asked Paul Robeson, like, well, what do you think about that? Like, do you agree? And I feel like Robeson immediately kind of detected, like, oh, I see what's going on here. And he was just like, no. I would put it like quite differently. No, like that's not, like, I disagree with like the entire framing of that you have to, if you're like a good communists have to give up their freedom. And then, he said, I think he was choosing his words like very carefully, but kind of saying that like, they're like, do you believe in, socialism, like democratic socialism, right? And he's like, yes, of course I mean democratic socialism, like that's absolutely necessary. And he was really so good at like talking to Americans about this stuff, but still they were like they were like doing a little tanky check on him. They were like, but Paul, like what about our individualism, man? And but he was like, I went to like Russia, and like this is a hard thing to quantify, but basically, he said one time I went down to South Carolina, and there was a black sharecropper who I met with, and he said like, welcome to our plantation fields. And he said, are you sure about that? It's like a very few number of people own all these plantations, and you just work and they exploit your labor. But he said, for what it's worth, from what he had seen inside the Soviet Union, that even though, yes, like they're in the dictatorship of the proletariat, there are certain things that, you don't, might be like, there are certain curtailments on things that we would consider like, absolute free speech or whatnot. But if you ask the average person on the street, his bet would be that they feel much more that they have at least like a stake in the entire country, and that they have like a certain part of it belongs to them, and everybody's in it together. And that's somewhat subjective, but so he would oppose that entire like paradigm of, in one society you're like totally free, and then the other society you're like totally equal. He doesn't really see it in those terms at all. So yeah.
It seems like the KPFA complex also hasn't changed very much.
Nope, since the beginning.
Still getting the same counter signals out of that section.
So Paul, like, dude, tell me.
And I mean, the Yeti is flesh and blood, wouldn't you say?
We are going to do a KPFA episode one of these days. We have to do that deep dive.
Yeah.
But, they were nice to Paul. They didn't blacklist him, etc. But,
yeah, true. They didn't try to lynch him, so I guess that they were good by the standards of the time. Anyway.
They almost ermed him a couple times over that. By the way, I also think, like, that French guy, like, chill out. Like, I want to give away my freedom for 2 generations. Like, no, that doesn't sound good to people. Like, like, I feel like Paul Robeson immediately was just like, oh God, like, why did that guy say that?
That's like the white liberal like thing today of like, like please execute me, like, for my like imperial, imperialist simplicity, like, let me kneel down and like wash your feet or whatever, like, or
it is just going a little too far. Like, chill out, like, get your government to stop like bombing Algeria first, and then work on giving up your freedom.
I'm feeling a little bit of like the psychoanalytic impulse myself when like people are like, I need to like tie myself up, like chain myself to the bed.
It's true. It was a thing.
That defines my philosophy. It's a joining one of we are a working people, a laboring people, a Negro people. There's a unity between our struggle and those of white workers in the South. I've had white workers shake my hand and say, Paul, we're fighting for the same thing. And so this defines my attitude toward socialism and toward many other things in the world. I do not believe that a few people should control the wealth of any land, that it should be a collective ownership in the interest of all.
Is that a democratic socialism, or?
It would have to be a democratic socialism. There are many ways, however, to struggle toward democracy, as I see that in a place like China, for example, today, the Soviet Union, many other places, or take our own problems of of Negroes, if we were free in the South tomorrow to carry our weight, to vote into everything, would we now look around and try to find the 10 billionaires among our people? Would we attempt to build them up, or would we try to answer the needs of the great millions of our people? And so I see other ways of life, socialism, as trying to solve the problems of millions and tens of millions of peoples at once, in a way, instead of we would start from the individual to the masses, they start from the masses this way. Now, there are two ways, and there are difficulties each way. I have made the decision to join in a collective struggle, and the reason that my personal sacrifices mean very little in the struggle. In one way, when you see the children of Little Rock, what does not giving a few concerts mean if you can make some other contribution? It's in that context. So nothing is perfect in the world. We're going toward it from different angles. I feel it's a great burden of proof on every society, on our own as well today.
Mr. Robeson, some years ago, I was talking to a French member of the Communist Party,
yes.
And in the course of our discussion, he said to me, you, Mr. Winkler, are a Jeffersonian Democrat.
Yes.
You can afford it in your rich land. But in my land and in other lands, we must give up our freedom now to certain men in order to achieve freedom for our children in the future. This is an act of faith for me, he said, giving up my freedom now. Do you find yourself sympathetic with...
I don't think that is, I would put it quite differently. Nor do I think that's any part of any socialist philosophy or communist philosophy, as far as I know. That we struck it during the war under Roosevelt, for example. We had to give up many privileges. They're practically telling us we have to do that again. I mean, in any sort of war economy, in England, for example, they have not eaten eggs almost for years and years because of certain pressures. And it seems to me in the socialist lands, the Soviet Union, China, and many places, that's quite true. It's one thing to say today that they don't have as shining apparel as we do, but they have made tremendous scientific progress, and within one generation, so to speak, within 40 years, have become one of the most powerful countries in the world. Now, they've done it by great sacrifices, and not by, to my mind, they feel that the country, in one sense, the man in the street, may not in every essence belong to him, but he feels it's much more his than, say, I do in Charleston, South Carolina, when one Southern American Negro explained to me that I was in the state of our great plantations. I said, are you sure about that? Our great plantations? I don't feel that they're my plantations. But in one sense, some of the people in the socialist lands feel that the country does belong to them in a real sense.
Before we go, further, should we just, circle back and, I don't know, fill in a little bit about his, biography? I mean, we're already an hour and a half in, but I think we mentioned in passing maybe his political evolution, most importantly, and
whatever
kind of
topic of it you want to cover. Yeah, for sure.
How did he end up becoming the greatest American tanky of all time?
How? Yeah.
How? Well, okay. So, I mean, basically, he grew up in Princeton, New Jersey, the college town. His father, who had been born a slave in North Carolina and then ran away, was a minister. He was a preacher in Princeton, and I guess really raised Paul to strive for excellence in every single category. I think his mom passed away when he was 5 or 6, but he was very prodigious student and an excellent athlete. So he got a football scholarship to Rutgers College. That, I guess, was a big moment for him because of the extremely violent racism he experienced when he tried out for the team. I think in the documentary it has him describing the first day of someone just came up and punched him in the face, and then people threw him on the ground and started stomping on him. But then he jumped back up and pounced on this other guy and was basically I'm gonna kill you, you son of a bitch. Then I guess they blowed the whistle and were all right, and he was like, I made the team. But that was like that was like his first thing. I guess his dad was like really instilled in him. You know, it's a classic thing. Like, you need to do everything like backwards and like in heel. Like, you need to be the absolute best. You need to like have the absolute best behavior. If you lash out at anybody who talks shit to you, or, you know, like hits you, then you'll be called a savage. And so you have to like play this game, and you just have to like figure out how to win it and like do whatever it takes. So like he was an All-American football player, kind of became like a star, and then afterwards he was in the NFL. I mean, can you like imagine this, that like he's in the NFL while going to Columbia Law School, and then he
that's crazy.
Yeah, which he didn't like love the law, but it figured like that was the easiest path for him to like a professional career. So he moved to Harlem and was like a big kind of like celebrity there. Like, everybody loved him, and you know, he became a lawyer. But then I guess he had like a pretty upsetting experience when he got a job at a white law firm. One of his first days there, he called in one of the white secretaries and asked her to dictate something, and she said like, I don't do dictation for N-words. And yeah, and then after that, like the kind of the partners in the firm kind of like informed him that, you know, none of the white clients they had would consent to him like working on their cases or representing them. So I think they tried to be like, oh, why don't you go up to like Harlem and like you can represent some black clients or something like that. But he was basically, the way they said in the documentary, he had no interest in like pursuing a profession that he couldn't rise to the top of. And so he realized law was like basically whatever. But then at the same time, he started getting into theater. And then that's when he started like auditioning for some parts and started getting parts, and became a really big part of like the New York avant-garde theater scene in the 1920s. And I guess he started shooting some like silent films at that time. He shot a film with Oscar Michaud, who I'd like to look into more. I guess he was like kind of the preeminent like black independent filmmaker in the 1920s. He did some like nude portrait studies with another like avant-garde photographer in the 1920s. And then I think that was when he first got the role of Othello, right?
That was he played Othello like a bit late, right? Didn't he?
Oh, yeah, I guess he did Eugene O'Neill plays, right?
Yeah. I remember he was in The Emperor Jones. That was like a big thing.
And All God's Chillin' Got Wings by Eugene O'Neill.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
It took a while for that to come out. I think that like that had some bumpy thing because it had some controversial plot line like involving like, well, that was like about miscegenation as well. Like it was about,
I think so.
Actually it's interesting because that play is about like a black lawyer who like is married to a white woman who like kind of like subconsciously like hates him and like sabotages his career and tries to like destroy him. So yeah, it's a pretty interesting role. The Emperor Jones though is probably what he was like most famous for, and that was kind of like about Haiti. You know, he sort of played like kind of a tyrant, sort of. He's a titular Emperor Jones.
Exactly. Yeah, it was in the backdrop of like the U.S. occupation of Haiti. I forget exactly when, but that was that was kind of a breakthrough for him.
Yeah, like I mean, like people's analysis of Paul Robeson's like performance in it, you know, they saw that like he kind of reclaimed like the play in the same way that he did with like Old Man River in some respects, because it's kind of I feel like it's a little bit like reactionary in terms of like Haiti, you know, not the best like perception on the best take on the Haiti situation.
Well, Eugene O'Neill was a Fabian. Let's be real.
I mean, Eugene O'Neill definitely had some problems.
Kind of a socialist, but like in that I think he was like hanging out with the Huxleys and shit. Like H.G. Wells, that whole group. But you know, I guess better than nothing.
I didn't really consider the like eugenic angle on Eugene O'Neill. I feel like my picture of Eugene O'Neill is that he was just like so like drunk that he like, you know,
I mean, I don't know how he felt about eugenics per se, but I just mean that general Fabian socialist milieu in like the UK. He was, I believe he was like a member of that, so I think, I don't know, I'm hard to say how sus he really was.
Again, like you know, I feel like maybe there's like is perhaps more sympathetic than some people, but yeah, the Emperor Jones definitely has. It's definitely something that's still taught in theater classes today when they're trying to, you know, have some diversity or whatever. But yeah, it definitely has its problems. But that was I would say like his breakout role before, you know, getting like Showboat and Othello and everything. Othello because, you know, Othello is like, yeah, that sort of shows a connection to this tradition of like the pathologization of like racial violence or racial oppression and things like that, you know, the crazy Othello.
And of course he was only I guess probably only the second black actor to play Othello in Britain since Ira Allenderidge, who was an American actor who played it in the 1820s. So basically in like 100 years, like I mean, this is a character who is described as a Moor by Shakespeare, right?
Yeah.
And there's been some like
supposed to be black,
basically supposed to be African, but they often played by like a white person in like brown face, right?
Oh yeah, for sure. Laurence Olivier played Othello in blackface, like, you know.
God,
I mean, that's like how that's how it was. I mean, the institution of blackface, like in the American theater, like it gets much deeper than that, I think. When he was coming up, really, like it was still a time when like you had tons of like really white people doing like blackface routines, and also like one of the main ways for black people to break in, like still, you know, in that sort of Follies era, you know, maybe during that time, like, you know, one of the main ways for black people to break into show business, like, you know, wasn't really doing these avant-garde plays, but a lot of the time it was doing things like minstrel shows, basically.
For sure. I mean, they went through that in the documentary, how they both showed a lot of different footage of blackface minstrel movies in the 1930s, which were like very popular. And then movies, they did start to have movies that did have black characters in them, but almost all of them were basically still minstrelsy. They were relegated to like servant roles or like goofy kind of like sidekicks or layabouts, or, you know, something menacing, but like never any character with any interiority or equal status. And so to the extent that like he really broke ground. I mean, I think by jumping into like Othello in what was the first year that he did it? In 1930, I believe. That was, you know, a huge deal because it also dealt, like you said, with miscegenation, the plot of that play. Yeah. And so it definitely stirred up a bit of like controversy and excitement and all these other things. And, you know, he like killed it, right? I mean, I think by all accounts, like it was a fantastic rendition of Othello. And he did that over in London. But then I think he came over back in the 30s. He, I think, came back to star in some movies. I think he also did star in the film version of The Emperor Jones. But most of the roles that he got at that, and he was like kind of a star by this point. I believe he'd started singing as well. You know, the plots were like extremely racist and like shitty, and he was relegated to roles that did not like meet his actual stature, like the Sanders of the River, which I think kind of like actually a lot of these were actually British films, because after a few years he got sick of like trying to labor under Hollywood, and they were like super restrictive. So he went to Britain, but then he found out that a lot of movies he ended up in were kind of like reifying like British imperialism in Africa and like colonialism and stuff.
Right. Sanders of the River, like I think that he like thought that was gonna be, you know, like a more accurate portrayal of like colonial rule in Africa, but then like it, you know, according to him, like in the last 5 days of shooting, they like went in and they like, you know, made it all about how base like British imperialism is.
Wow, they did those pickups and just jammed it in
said,
there.
The imperialist plot had been placed in the plot during the last 5 days of shooting. I was roped into the picture because I wanted to portray the culture of the African people, and I committed a faux pas which convinced me that I had failed to weigh the problems of 150 million native Africans. I hate the picture.
He did hate it. He did also that So part of that, or part of the significance of that, is that while he was in Britain, starring in Othello, and he was there for like a couple years, he was there for some years, like in the early 1930s, he and his wife Essie started, who was no intellectual slouch herself. I think I forget which Ivy League she went to. She like studied chemistry and stuff, but she was really like kind of his manager and like his sort of advocate. But they both started going to the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and they both started learning foreign languages, including Swahili. And this is like where Robeson started to develop like a really passionate interest in Africa. And I guess he wrote an essay around that time titled "I Want to Be an African." But interestingly, he made friends with some fellow young students who were there, including Kwame Nkrumah, who of course was like the later, or like decades later, would become the first like socialist president of Ghana, who I think was overthrown in a coup that the CIA had something to do with. But and Jomo Kenyatta as well, who was the prime minister of Kenya in the 1960s and the president, and was a big like anti-colonial activist. So he started meeting these kind of like African sort of proto-revolutionary types, and learned a lot about like the struggle against like European imperialism there, and basically got kind of hyped up with that. But then at the same time, something else kind of funny happened, where I guess after a concert in London, this is like I think in like 1932, a very important thing happened where he left the concert, and like marching past were a gigantic like crowd of marching and striking Welsh miners who were singing like folk labor songs basically. And I guess he was like so struck by like the beauty of like their songs and like their just the presence of them, that he just like joined them and started marching with them like immediately. And after that, like he got to go to Wales, and he went and met with like the Welsh coal miners, and I guess like he developed this like affinity for like Welsh people, for their folkloric like traditions, for their songs, which he compared to basically like African American music and like African folk traditions. Kind of one of the earliest times where he like connected to disparate folk cultures and kind of saw this like this commonality or whatever, and he like went down to the mines with the Welsh miners to like observe their conditions. And I guess like a Welsh miner, he relayed this in the KPFK interview, told him, "You don't belong with like the fancy do-whats or whatever up there. Like you're one of us. Like you're a working person. Like you're an oppressed working person. And so like you shouldn't identify with like those rich bougie British people that you meet in London." And I guess like he agreed and was like, yeah, this is badass. So he started agitating a lot for like the labor struggle in like the Welsh mining areas. And that I think is also, and then meeting these African, anti-colonial Africans who were studying London. I think this is probably around the time that he started reading maybe some little bit of Marx and Engels and people like that, maybe a little Lenin in this period. But then when he was, starring in these movies in the 30s, they would trick him into making movies that like stand British imperialism. So he obviously hated that and like it sucked.
Yeah. Well, again, he kind of like he thought like he signed up for that on the condition that they would portray Africans positively. And that was something that came out of like his studies of African cultures and like Swahili. And he was like, oh, I'll play like the leader of the Africans in this film, and I can give him dignity. It was the same kind of thing where he was trying to like do kind of a subversive performance that would kind of go against the grain of the material a little bit, but they like got really heavy-handed with like how pro-imperialist it was like in those like last 5 days of shooting. He actually got so pissed off that he tried to like buy like all printings of the movie so that it like would never be shown.
Yeah, to cap off like how he felt about Hollywood and the British film industry, In that book, it said, like, ultimately Robeson was disgusted by the Uncle Tom and Stepin Fetchit roles he was continually offered in the United States, appearing in only one other American film, the all-star Tales of Manhattan in 1942. However, the film's stereotypical representation of blacks as foolish and superstitious confirmed Robeson's suspicion that the Hollywood film industry, as a vertically integrated capitalist enterprise, was incapable of producing progressive representations of black characters and black life. Still kind of rings true today, doesn't it? Like,
yeah.
I mean, it's progressed kind of like not as much as you would hope. I think in what is this,
about before,
80
like,
years?
It requires like an institutional change that's like not going to be made.
Yes.
I don't know.
And he was right, as a vertically integrated capitalist enterprise, and definitely by 1942 he was thinking in those terms as Hollywood. You can't just do like Ryan Murphy's Hollywood and like I don't know, Hollywood like ends racism by fiat in like 1951, and also the Red Scare never existed. But anyways, so.
There's an old man called the Mississippi. That's the old man I don't like to be. What does he care if the world's got troubles? What does he care if the land ain't free? That old man river, he must know something, but don't say nothing. He just keeps rolling, he keeps on rolling along. He don't plant potatoes, he don't plant cotton. Them that plants them is soon forgotten, but old man river, he just keeps rolling along. You and me, we sweat and strain, body all aching and racked with pain. Tote that barge and lift that bale, you show a little grit, and you lands in the jail. But I keeps laughing instead of crying. I must keep fighting until I'm dying, and old man river, he'll just keep rolling
So I thought for a second we can talk about a little bit about Paul Robeson's political evolution in the 1930s and how he increasingly got involved with various radical political struggles, and then how that led into World War II, where, you know, in a very curious historical anomaly, he was able to become the #1 celebrity in the United States while also being like an open sympathizer with the Soviet Union for that period of time. But so, you know, going back to like when he was in the he enrolled in the School of Oriental and African Studies in London in 1934. You know, he met people like Kwame Nkrumah, and started associating with like the anti-imperialist movement and various British socialists, got into the Welsh mining struggles. And I guess his exposure to all of that led him to decide to visit the Soviet Union, which he did in December 1934 at the invitation of Sergei Eisenstein, the famous Soviet film director.
Yes.
And Eisenstein invited him to the USSR to basically talk about doing a movie that he was sort of, mulling over about the Haitian Revolution that he maybe wanted Robeson to star in. Unfortunately, I guess it never materialized. But on the way to the Soviet Union, he had a stopover in Berlin and basically saw like Nazism up close and was like, yikes, and realized kind of like the level of racism and fasciness that was occurring in that country. And when he got to Moscow, he said very famously, we quoted it earlier, "Here I am not a Negro, but a human being for the first time in my life. I walk in full human dignity." And I guess he did some performances there, accompanied by the piano, and had a pretty great time. As you said, like they definitely did kind of like roll the red carpet out for him, so to speak. But he, I guess, traveled around to a number of different places and was like very inspired by what he saw overall. So then he started getting into the Spanish Civil War later in the 30s. He really started to believe that like the upcoming struggle against fascism was going to be like the defining, battleground basically for the workers' movement and the civil rights movement. He sort of saw basically, I think quite correctly, the sort of the synergy between like violent white or ethnic supremacist kind of ideology and then like a totalitarian kind of version of capitalism, basically imperialism, that was going to basically, strike back hard at the sort of, Bolshevik threat that it had encountered. So he went to Spain during the Civil War a couple times and sang for the Republican and the International Brigades and sang to wounded soldiers. He visited the battlefront, I guess provided a big morale boost for them at a tough time. He went back to England and hosted Jawaharlal Nehru in support of Indian independence. Then he, around the late 30s, he reevaluated the direction of his career and decided to focus more on the ideals of common people. And he actually, at this time, he appeared in a pro-labor play called Plant in the Sun, in which he played an Irishman, which was his first white role, which is kind of interesting.
Interesting,
yeah. And then he...
well, yes, very, yeah. Well, those Irish. Yeah.
Well, I mean, he supported them too. Their liberation struggle. Yes. He definitely had love for like the peripheral Europeans. You know what I mean? Like.
Yeah, definitely.
Not the Teutons so much, but then he did make Proud Valley. That was his last British film, and that was like a pro-labor drama set in a Welsh coal mining town. And I guess that the experience of making that movie kind of further radicalized him even more. He got even deeper with like the Welsh coal miners that he loved. And then big turning point happens with the start of World War II, and he decides to go back to the United States, which at this point, under FDR, had a kind of tentative alliance with the Soviet Union against the Nazis. And so he figured that he could play maybe a productive role back in his home country and, support the war effort against fascism. So I guess he got brought on like a radio special called Ballad for Americans in 1940 after he had moved back to Connecticut. And he gave this like singing performance where I think he sang the Star Spangled Banner and a couple of other patriotic songs, and it was like a smash hit. It was like they got more phone calls than they ever got to the radio station, and it like recatapulted Robeson back to being like the #1 star in America. And he was incredibly active during the war, going around like giving events like to buy U.S. war bonds. He met with Soviet emissaries that were like coming to America to sort of hold rallies to like support the Lend-Lease program and things like that. That was at the time that he met and became friends with two people from the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee in the Soviet Union, Solomon Mikols and Itzik Pfeffer, who will kind of come up later. And Yeah, this is also the time I thought it was like worth mentioning, because I saw there was some like socialist account on Twitter recently that kind of it quoted a popular line that the Communist Party USA head came up with, I think in 40 or 41, during this Popular Front period, where like liberals and like communists were, you know, kind of allied. That is, communism is, or it would go either way. Either socialism or communism is 20th century Americanism. And somebody posted that the other day with like a picture of Paul Robeson during World War II with like a big American flag behind him, kind of implying that that was Paul Robeson's philosophy, and we should try to do that. I think it was kind of in like a post-left kind of way. They were sort of suggesting this, that instead of like, I don't know, running around like leftists like calling America KKK like the shittiest country ever and it sucks and like let's burn flags, like embracing, like trying to find a way to like promote socialism in a patriotic context. And so, and then that tweet got lit up by a lot of people. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, you know, like you're misrepresenting Paul Robeson. And I think it is kind of misrepresenting Paul Robeson to some degree. I think it's kind of taking that particular line of theirs like out of context a little bit, because they were doing that at a moment when there was a popular front, they were engaged in a war, and I do think there's like a grain of something there, and I think it's worth paying attention to that Robeson would, you know, kind of go along with that kind of framing of, say, like, you know, communism or, you know, like a radical workers movement or something, that almost in like that late 19th century like prairie populist kind of way, there are certain currents that in American culture, and even if you're looking at it through a Marxist angle, you know, Marx spoke about how relative to the, you know, economic and political systems that were in place in the 18th century, the American Revolution was like relatively progressive. But it doesn't mean that it's like it's progressive in the way that like Americans worship it as like just this amazing event. Like obviously it ensconced like slavery in half of the country, and you know also set up like a lot of like anti-democratic things.
Yeah, they were mostly trying to wrest control of like the slave system and like enrich themselves. It was like it was a counter-revolution, but anyway, yeah.
Well, I mean, some people are kind of saying that nowadays, that it's like a counter-revolution, but I think that also kind of like maybe gives the nefarious Malthusian scum of the British Empire a little bit too much credit, that like they were gonna like end slavery and they were gonna do all these progressive things, but the evil American farmers didn't want them to. I think it's a little more complicated than that.
They didn't end slavery because they were progressive. They ended up because they found better ways to exploit Africa. Or that
exactly.
Profitable,
it stopped being useful to them, and so they wanted to get rid of it.
Yes.
Yeah. But I think that like if you look at it through like Marx is like pretty clear-eyed, I think, about that still it was a bourgeois revolution. Like I think I would prefer calling it a bourgeois revolution rather than like a counter revolution, because the force they were replacing was like
it wasn't
older
really
and
countering anything so much. Yeah, true.
Yeah, counter revolution implies that you're countering a revolution that exists, and it's hard to say that Britain was that. But you know, there's that aspect.
It's kind of like an edgy designation, but
it is. But I would say bourgeois revolution, I think objectively that's like pretty much what it was, and for that time it did spark a flame that led to more revolutions. I mean, including places like Haiti, though I don't think any of the founding fathers would have particularly like wanted to inspire that, but you know, nonetheless it created a rupture that inaugurated kind of a new phase of like, you know, human of civilization, at least, you know, in the sort of Atlantic world.
Yeah, I mean, Haiti also like was in a longer kind of lineage of like slave revolts as well. But yeah, obviously that was an aspect of the American Revolution. Yeah, I'm hearing a little bit of some Hamilton undertone stirring in the background right now.
Yeah. No, I definitely. But I think it's really interesting to focus on this like for a second, because Paul Robeson's like approach as a full-on, like, even though he was never in a party, I think, like, sentimentally he was like a capital C communist, basically, in terms of like what he supported and everything. Even he, who's like the most kind of ideologically steadfast and pure and like well-read in like Marxist-Leninist theory, like tried to use his celebrity to like mainstream socialist ideas in a slightly sub-rosa way, but also wrapped in the flag, and tried to propose kind of like an alternate conception of American patriotism that was actually rooted in more like socialist, anti-elite, like egalitarian values. And well, I think like he would probably have been the first. I never saw like his exact comments on like FDR, but I would assume that he would, based on everything else he said, that he would point. And actually in the KPFK interview, he points out a lot when he talks about dictatorship of the proletariat. He talks about like all the rights that had to be restricted during World War II when we were fighting fascism, and kind of like analogize that to like the period of the Russian Revolution and building, fighting the Russian Civil War and like extreme measures that needed to be taken. He also compared it to Reconstruction and said that we basically had some kind of like, it wasn't a dictatorship of the proletariat, but it was kind of a dictatorship over the South after we won the war. And he said, in my personal opinion, I think that dictatorship could have lasted much longer. And so he actually like advocates like he, would have supported Lincoln's policy of Reconstruction, but he would have like kept it in place for, he would have actually, gone through a kind of like revolutionary process and everything. It was canceled. It was trying to, there was certain radical Republicans or whatever like did want to socially reform, and for a while there were black senators, there were black congressmen and things like that, and then that all ended. Like, people forget that. People think it went straight from like liberating the slaves to sharecroppers, but there was like basically a 10-year period where there was a lot of social experimentation going on. And in fact, like Marx, in the letters he wrote to Lincoln during the war, was like praising Lincoln. Again, like he was aware that Lincoln was like a bourgeois, political leader in a capitalist country, but there was and I think it's fair to say that these were not kind of like opportunistic, like weird trot entryism tactics, but were like very savvy and trying to get inroads where you can and make ground where you can. I think Robeson was like singularly like very aware and astute about the way in which you would have to sell socialist ideas to American audiences. Like, you would have to pick a very particular tack.
It gets into kind of an interesting situation. On one hand, Paul Robeson did later on embrace like kind of internationalism, and like despite all these efforts, like he was definitely seen as being like extremely anti-American,
which he was, and he wouldn't have disputed like after the late 40s. I mean, that's the thing, is like this was only during World War II when he had this idea of like socialism is 20th century Americanism and stuff. Like, after America started like blacklisting everybody he knew and persecuting him, it was like actually, I mean, then he starts calling America fascist, basically. Right?
Exactly. Or like that his struggle against American imperialism is a continuation of the fight against fascism, which is an interesting kind of angle to take. You don't want to get too far down the road of like, no, what's wrong with socialism and nationalism, or like, what, but
Robeson was not about that. He was still doing it in the context of like, we should unite in the international struggle against the Nazis and the fascists. Right. Like,
no, but I get your point. But it's also interesting, like, in terms of your comments about Marx, this is like kind of neither here nor there, but in the context of the time, it is interesting to consider. I feel like, Marx, like, kind of, he wrote approvingly even about like people like Adam Smith. It's something I brought up before. Our image of Marx is influenced by the ideological ossification that happened like in the ensuing centuries. Like, Marx can be actually kind of seen as part of like the liberal tradition, like more broadly. Like now, like people will be like, "What? Like liberal? Like no?
Yeah.
Like but like
yeah,
you know,
yeah." Well, both supporters and detractors of Marx could see reacting that way of like, he's not a fucking liberal, but like I know what you mean.
Yeah.
It's an evolution of the liberal tradition. It's like the next stage. He was trying to find like the next advanced plateau of like the values of liberalism, which he thought was, I would say generally he had like respect for the things that they claimed to uphold, but like his critique was that you're not actually upholding these things. Like this masks an actual power system in which like the very few basically control the destinies of the many, and like your laws, like while they have some good intentions behind them, are fundamentally set up, you know, to like reify private property and et cetera, right?
Right. Yes. His critique of capitalism was also informed by like the theory of capitalism, and like the, you know, his theory of capitalism built upon like, you know, more conventional like liberal economic theories of capitalism. And you know, he was a student of economics like in that respect, as well as of philosophy and other things.
As Chomsky said, you know, he was studying in the Imperial Library, and I think he should have.
I mean, that's just as bad. Going to the library to read a book is really not any different from being best friends with someone who like introduced 1 million toxic weapons to the Vietnam War. You know, exactly.
Going
to a library is the same as being BFFs with like John Douche, and you know. Anyway,
that's who we're left with when you blacklist somebody like Paul Robeson. You're left with like the crumbs at the bottom of the cereal box, like relatively speaking. You know, can you imagine like Paul Robeson just like firing off these like lazy fallacies and just like being like so smug and annoying and like easy to like. Can you imagine Robeson like debating Foucault? My God, I would give anything.
Even at like his lowest, when you know he was like really struggling with his relatively justified fears of being a targeted individual and like in his mental health, he probably like would not have been like, you know, whining about like how actually like Gordon MacDonald like was a Vietnam War protester or whatever. You know.
No, you wouldn't have got any of that. But you know,
he actually helped us fight global warming by accidentally discovering evidence of it during his efforts to develop weapons to destroy the ozone layer over Vietnam and eradicate all life.
To irradiate the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. No such confusion here from Paul. He's pretty consistent.
Yes, with the Red Army go the heroes. Oh, maidens, fair raise your eyes. Gaze upon the road we follow. Far and away the road goes winding. Look and see how merrily the road goes. See how merrily the road goes. Oh, maidens, fair raise your eyes. Maidens, wipe away the teardrops. Now let's all sing together louder. Sing with us our battle song united. Oh, Polushka, Poljedi, Polushka, Shiroka, Polje. Jeduti popolju geroji, ekta krasni armiji geroji. Jeduti popolju geroji, ekta krasni armiji geroji. Jedem kruгом колхозы, наш лошади, девушки, колхозы, эх, там молодые наши села, наши девушки, колхозы, эх, там молодые наши села, эх, полюшка, поле, полюшка, широко поле, едут и по полю герои, эх-то Красной Армии герои, эх, rolling green open field, rolling clean wide open prairie, heroes go riding across the prairie, yes, with the Red Army go the